David, I don't know if you've had the chance to go to the Aksheva River yet since you've come back.
No, I just arrived last night. And, but the river is quite near here, yes?
Right around the block.
Yes.
Yes.
I haven't gone yet. I haven't immersed myself. I haven't sprinkled water on my face.
Mm.
But I feel it.
Have some of you been? Yes. You've seen the fish? They're standing there now. Aftenposten writes about it. About 500 of them have arrived.
Really? Wow.
Nobody really knew how many would be this year, because they haven't been stocked as they used to be for the last 2 years. They weren't. And so this is an ongoing experiment in how well they're actually able to sustain and regenerate themselves. I saw 2 fish just now, just before coming here. One was just gently moving with the current. It always astounds me how little energy it takes for them to endure this powerful current going against them. Effortless almost. But the other was dead, floating there, a corpse. And it really brought it near that what we're celebrating here is also commemoration of those who have passed. It's both. And it's somehow looking to ride or dance on that delicate edge between suffering and rejuvenation, between those who disappear amongst us, some of whom disappear forever, and those who still struggle to return and bring more abundance, more diversity, more liveliness, more inwardness, more joy to. And it's so wonderful to have you with us, David. We've been excited and look forward to this conversation with you.
Well, I'm just delighted to be here. I'm overjoyed to be back in Norway after some years in this luscious land where the sun is so low in the sky. So I'm a cultural ecologist and a philosopher, or what some call a geophilosopher, that is somebody working out ways of thinking under the influence of a more than human earth. How do we think? How do we speak? How do we walk? I suppose as an ecologist, my particular fascinations, well, there are many, but primarily 2. I am really curious about what we could call the ecology of sensory experience, or the ecology of perception. The way that our animal senses, the ears, the eyes, the skin, even the nostrils, the activity of these senses, it seems to me, functions almost like a glue that binds our separate nervous systems into the encompassing ecosystem. And I am fascinated with this. Different ways of perceiving the world, of sensing the earth around us. But I'm also just as fascinated by what we could speak of or call the ecology of language, how what we say has such a profound effect upon what we see or what we hear or even taste of the earth around us. Because I'm convinced that there are ways of speaking that many of us have inherited from this goofy civilization into which we were born or into which we were educated, ways of speaking that actually frustrate and inhibit that spontaneous sensory kinship with the earthly sensuous around us. But I'm just as convinced that there are other ways of speaking, waiting for us, beckoning to our tongues, ways of speaking that can actually encourage and enhance that instinctive reciprocity between our animal body and the animate earth around us. And so that's the terrain wherein I tend to dance.
I'd like to share a little story, and the story will lead into a question to you. Some of you were there this morning already when we inaugurated the festival with a beautiful workshop with students from Oslo and teachers from Oslo, but also city council members and a number of artists. And it's not a story of salmon, but it is a related story. Well, actually, that's actually not true. Because the story I shared with you this morning, I only realized afterwards, is indeed the story of salmon. But I didn't tell you that. And that matters, because I forgot myself. So here's the full story in brief. It's the story of the first river, whoever claimed me in my entire being, whoever took possession of me, so much so that it became almost a haunting presence inside my body. That at points I loved so much, and at points I endured, and at points I felt like I needed to get out of. It was the arrival every year in spring, and then the arrival every year in autumn from the opposite direction of the skies of tens of thousands of cranes, gruskus, European cranes, filling the air with yearning, with an intensity that is first and foremost in the body, and then from the body it urges itself, pushes itself into every last corner of the territory that is this boy, Martin, on the Oder River. It's the Oder River, the border river between former East Germany, country I was born in, and Poland at the time. They all fly, tens of thousands of them, twice a year through a narrow corridor, only a few tens of kilometers wide, all of them from the northern regions, from Scandinavia and the Baltics, gather, fly through the bottleneck, and fill the air. But I also realized in later years that the yearning inside of me started weeks before they even arrived, as an expectation that I had learned to take for granted, and that at some point I could no longer live without. And now, 16 years after I've made this my home, Oslo, the yearning still comes twice a year. And at points it's almost unbearable, because now the yearning is no longer met with their calling. However, it's not yet a story about salmon, is it? This is where I stopped the story this morning. Now, what I didn't know at the time, and what took me many years in my adulthood coming to Norway and making salmon not just a passion, but also a way of living. I realized that I had grown up on a river of ghosts. Salmon used to come back to our river as well, but they had slipped into an oblivion so deep that they not only disappeared from the land, but they disappeared from memory itself, from story, from culture. And this is where I'd like to lead this over into a question to you, David, or more of a theme that I'd love to explore with you, which is something you write about. I believe it's in Becoming Animal, in your second book from 2010. You write about the importance of not only restoring lands, but also restoring cultures, and perhaps even hearts. And the deep entanglements of those, the ways in which the concrete actions we do in the land to help some of these creatures come back, or to only give way and make space, on their own may not be enough. We also need to work on the level of culture, of the imagination, of language, to enrich the imagination even of what can be again. And it's not even a good question, I realize that. But it's It's something I keep thinking about, and something that's also reflected in what we are trying to gather to here, and what we're trying to do here together in Oslo in this time.
Yes. It does seem to me that there is no restoring of habitat, restoring and replenishing of species. There's no restoring the land without restoring the land, without beginning to practice the craft of storytelling in a manner that replenishes and rejuvenates oral culture. By oral culture, I mean the culture of face-to-face and face-to-place storytelling. All of the cultures that we ecologists tend to extol, cultures that have lived in some kind of basic respect and reciprocity with their surrounding landscapes for generation after generation, century after century after century, often millennia after millennia, without destroying the ability of that landscape to replenish itself and rejuvenate. These indigenous cultures that we so often praise and that are so different from one another. In every part of the world, these cultures are so diverse and strangely unique and contrasting with each other. Sometimes it can seem like they come from other planets or other solar systems. They're so strangely different in their life ways and their beliefs. And yet, this remarkable respect and restraint toward the more than human earth, all of these indigenous cultures are what almost all, we would have to say, are oral cultures. That is, cultures that developed and thrived and flourished for generation after generation in the absence of any formalized writing system. So indigenous cultures, by and large, are oral cultures, cultures that don't have a written down set of texts. And hence, they are cultures of story. All of the accumulated knowledge of one's ancestors about how to live in this land without destroying it and without destroying one another has to be held. Well, for us, it's held in books, and we go look up the right book, or we study it in our courses in school or in college. But in cultures without books, how is all of that old ancestral knowledge preserved? It's held in stories. It's as though stories are the living encyclopedias of an oral culture. All of that knowledge is stored there in the stories. But then we could ask, how is it that the stories are remembered and passed down from father to son to grandson, from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter? How are these stories handed along and remembered over centuries and centuries? And the answer to this has not been so well understood by the scholars until slowly now it's beginning to spread this new awareness that the stories are remembered not just because you hear them all the time. In North America, where I live, or Turtle Island as we call it, in North America or Turtle Island, many of the great teaching stories told regularly by the native peoples are not told all the time. In fact, they're only told in the deep of winter, so that the other animals will not hear them. In the dark of winter, many of the animals are sleeping, are hibernating. And so they won't hear you talking about them and feel offended or insulted. But the stories, the great teaching stories of so many cultures are not told all the time. They're told in the appropriate season, in that right moment of the year. And so then how are they learned and remembered and passed on? It turns out that the stories of a deeply oral culture are associated with particular sites and places in the surrounding landscape where those stories happen, or where the events in those stories happen. And so when you are walking through the land, when you're out gathering herbs or tracking particular animals, and you come upon that bend in the river, it triggers the memory of the story of how that bend came to be there. Or when you see that cave mouth in the distance, it again releases the memory of the story of how that cave was shaped out by the thumbprint of your old ancestor. Or how this mountain came. That is, the land is sprouting with stories that spring forth from every creek, from every dry riverbed, from every cluster of rocks or cliff face. Each of these carries stories. That is to say, the land is the primary mnemonic or memory trigger for releasing the stories within us. So just to give a simple example, my friend, the American poet Gary Snyder, was visiting Australia some years ago, and he was visiting some of the Aboriginal peoples in the red center of Australia. And at one point he was taken through the land in a pickup truck by an old Aborigine elder named Grandpa Jimmy Chungarai. So Jimmy is driving a pickup truck. He's an old Pintubi man, Pichanjara man. He's driving Gary through the outback, and he's telling Gary some of the stories about the Wallaby women who are going along in that place, and they bumped into some of the crocodile men. And they got into a big fight, and the crocodiles went running up on that hill over there where they bumped into the green ant people. And the green ants and the crocodiles got into a big fight. And the green ants came running down this way, and the crocodiles came running down that way. And he's telling the story so fast that Gary Snyder wants him to slow down so he can follow the story. But then suddenly Gary realized, with a start, that these stories, of course, were originally meant to be told while walking. And yet they are now driving through the outback in a pickup truck. And so they're passing each of the places where these stories happen very rapidly. And so you have to pace the speed of your speaking to the speed at which you're moving through the terrain. I mean, the intensity of language's link to the land is so thick, it's so entangled, that yes, you have to pace the speed of your speaking to the speed at which you're moving through the terrain. This is how deeply language is bound to the land in an oral culture, in a traditionally oral culture. And I think today, if we wish to replenish the wild salmon, if we wish to replenish our affinities with the breathing earth, to replenish the forests, to replenish the oceans and the winds and the weather patterns, I think we need to rejuvenate oral culture. I think we need to begin practicing telling stories again. Not just reading stories to our children from books, but taking our kids out of doors and improvising a story with our whole body about, just the wind that comes blustering through the city streets at night, carrying people's hats off their heads, or just what happens inside that forest edge every full moon. That is, oral culture is local culture. It's the culture of intimate relation with the local earth. So, telling stories, yeah.
One of the themes we began talking about this morning was precisely weaving stories and interweaving different strands of different story. Stories that are called by and summoned by this river, that is our river, the river we're honoring here today. And in some ways, that is what we are doing here for this weekend. Just to mention some of the ongoing strands that have only just begun. This morning we were visited on screen by a man called Peter Dean. Peter Dean is an artist. He is now out in Skagerrak in the ocean on a sailboat. And he just went on the boat today, and he will be sailing through the night tomorrow and then through the night to arrive here at the mouth of the river at 4:06 in the afternoon on Sunday. 4:06 is the moment of sunset, the moment of transition between dark and light. When he arrives, he will be welcomed by a number of us. Anybody's welcome to join, please. And then we will go on a light procession up the river, curated by Jessica Edelsetted in close collaboration with us, where we will be rowing partly through the culvert beneath the central station, because part of the river is underground, but the salmon are not phased by that. They continue their upward journey. And we will be walking past bridges, and every bridge will be welcoming us with an offering. I hear that a preacher of a church in Sagene will be giving two preachers actually. There might be juggling, I hear. There'll be chanting. There'll be walking in silence. The Red Rebels of Extinction Rebellion will be walking in silence for a part. And children will be giving a blessing at the spawning site, the culmination of the walk. Upon which we come back here for a poetry concert with Osman Saib, whose new book, This is Dead de Sommerbolle, just came out today. He's been working hard for months to finish it in time for the festivities, in time for the salmon to be honored with his read poetry, and Marte Wulf, the artist. Many more. Children who have worked for months trying to imagine the inner lives of fish and writing a story and then turning the story into a small documentary film, which was presented for the first time this morning and will be shown at Sukkerbieten on Sunday. A small, beautiful piece of art. And many more. We are trying to breathe life into what it could mean to be story. And it's a work of community. It's a work of getting together, of inviting in, at some point surrendering, letting go, and realizing this is beyond anybody's ability to understand or control it in entirety, and that's beautiful. And there's a lot of goodwill, a lot of generosity. And this I find, it seems to me that part at least of this generosity seems to be rising right out of the river. Because the river, in so many ways, is teaching us what it means to be abundant, what it means to have so much to give that it in some ways cannot be exhausted if only we encounter it watchfully and empathically and carefully and lovingly. the salmon who refuse to die, who refuse to be extinguished, despite some saying they are superfluous. They've come to be sacrificed because we have an industry that has become too large to fail. They refuse to die even when 6,000 liters of chlorine eradicated it. This morning we shared a story of salmon on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, on Turtle Island on the Pacific coast, where salmon for a century leapt against a dam in the river, coloring the river red with their blood, refusing to go extinct entirely, leaping year after year until the dams were taken out in 2012, becoming at the time the largest dam removal ever in history. Now there is a larger dam removal ongoing now on the Klamath River in Northern California, another famed salmon river, home to the Yurok tribe and other indigenous nations, where 4 large dams are now signed into law to be removed by the state of California.
Blessed be. Wow. Yeah. This is, many of us have been working to get these dams removed for decades. Also, the dams on the Snake River, the Columbia River dams. So slowly, it is beginning to happen. And who is making it happen? First and foremost, it's the river. First and foremost, it's the salmon themselves, who are haunting our dreams and nourishing us steadily, feeding our bodies, but they are feeding our minds, our imagination. And one begins to get the sense that human history itself was never made just by humans, that there are other agencies afoot that move things and that move us and work within the deep unconscious of the earth itself. In the Pacific Northwest, where the Klamath River is, the salmon is the great totemic power of the whole Northwest Coast region. It is like a god or a goddess that informs all of life in the Pacific Northwest. Though we forgot this for a long time. But slowly, inexorably, practices are returning. First salmon ceremonies are beginning to be practiced, not just by the native peoples there, but by native and white and brown peoples all together, whoever lives in the vicinity of one of these salmon streams, celebrating the return of the salmon to the waters, but with all sorts of luscious rituals, including salmon dances, where people don hats and don masks of salmon shape and salmon visage, and they sing and chant the salmon songs, and they dance very intricate dances that mimic the cycling life of these ocean-going avatars of the mountain forests, the salmon. There are others who, when a particular run of salmon heads back up their river and into the tributaries and then into the small streams, there are people who now put on masks, that is dive masks and snorkels and flippers on their feet, and they just swim upstream with the salmon. Yeah, that was started by Tom Jay, the great salmon sculptor. Yeah, and then you visited the home of Freeman House, a great salmon sage of Northern California, who was sort of the leader of a group of people who carefully were wooing the salmon back up into into the streams, into the river, the Matol River, and getting them to come back up. And they had to, it was a kind of magic, trying to invite the sound, come. And they changed the gradient of the streams. They found new pebbles that were just the perfect size that the salmon love, and filled up the stream beds with those pebbles, whatever it took, until the salmon began gracing that land again with their presence. And someone like Freeman House and someone like Tom Jay, I don't know if you met either of them, but because they apprenticed themselves to this fish for so long, both of them, each in their own way, began to look a lot like salmon. You're starting to get some of that quality.
Wait till tomorrow night, till the performance. We'll be shape-shifting tomorrow.
Good.
I never actually went into his home. Freeman House, Totem Salmon, Life Lessons of Another Species. I think he published the book the same year as the Sensious was published.
Really?
I think so.
96.
96. Found it in a thrift shop on an army base in Germany when I was a teenager. And it seemed so strange. I'd never cared about or known salmon, as I told you already. Salmon were non-existent in my world. And it was cheap. I had no money, and I read everything at the time. Okay, I'll read this. I read it. It touched me deeply. But then I went on, and it wasn't until that opinion piece in Nightingale's Sleep in 2010 that other way of relating to a species hit me fully in my being, and there was an uproar in me to the kind of oblivion in story and the kind of poverty of story that leads some of us to think we have the authority, we have the power, we have the moral authority to decide over the life or death of another species. We did want to visit him, and we planned a trip in 2018 to go to the Matol River and share the performance with him. However, he passed away that summer. Yes. But we had already reached out to them, to the community, and they said, listen, our entire community is in mourning because Freeman is gone. But we'd like you to come. We'd like you to play for us at our mourning ceremony. So we went and we played for the village only days after he passed away. So almost 20 years went between the time I read his book and the one chance shot I had at meeting in person, and I missed him by days. But we did speak and we did share with the community and express to them that our work in so many ways is a way of thanksgiving to work he started on a different continent many years before us.
Yes.
And such are the ways of salmon. They touch local culture and then they migrate. And so they go into hiding, and sometimes they're gone for a long time, and you don't know where they are and how they've gotten there. And suddenly they're here again.
Yes.
How? How did they come here?
And when I speak of Freeman House, who was a dear friend of mine.
Right. Yes.
I knew him very well. And how he looked like salmon, he really did. It puts me in mind of this piece, a written record of, or a written transcription of some oral tellings among the Skagit Indians. And it was written up in some ethnographic research in the 19-teens, around 1920, just before then, of how some of the Skagit Indians, a few generations before, when they accompanied. Well, I have to preface this by saying that for so many of the old indigenous or traditionally oral cultures living in the vicinity of salmon, including in Japan, northwest coast of North America. Yes, also here in Scandinavia, the Sami.
The Sami.
Yeah. That it seems to have been very common in these cultures, this belief that the salmon, when they are not visiting us, and they head back out into the ocean and joining their waterborne ways with these huge ocean currents circulating in vast gyres within this cauldron of the sea, that the salmon, once they journey off beyond the horizon, they take off their salmon garb and live in their own villages, going about their lives in basically human form. But whenever it's time to visit the coast again and to visit the humans, they put on their salmon garb and head back. So among the Skagit peoples, this belief was so entrenched and deep set that when the first few peoples of the tribe journeyed back on one of the ships, one of the European ships that for the first time had anchored near their lands and had journeyed back to the east coast, which was already settled for a long time. And they saw in the cities all these pale, pink-skinned people like me walking around in those cities. They reported back to the tribe that they had been to salmon country and had seen the salmon walking around as human beings. It's just so beautiful. So one has a sense that humans and salmon have been in this entwined and entangled dance for a long, long time in many parts of the world.
Since time immemorial, gosh, so many threads to weave. Which ones to choose? I'll choose maybe two different ones. The Science of Ecology tells that story in their own logos, their own poetry. It's a story of shape-shifting, of salmon becoming other and other becoming salmon again. The shorthand version of it, or the headline of that story, is "Salmon are keystone species." Nøkkelarter. And the image, if you don't already know the image, imagine an arch in a church built of bricks, the portal of an arch. And there's one stone, the center top stone of the arch, that holds the entire construction in a delicate balance. Remove that one stone and the delicate balance collapses. That's the keystone. Get that image? Salmon are called keystone species. There are many others in the waters and the lands. Wolves, some of the great cetaceans in the seas, in the oceans. Wildebeest in the Serengeti, otters, sea otters, many, many others. This morning we spoke about the river pearl mussels, in our river, Nakashelva, that are also keystone species. But salmon are keystones, and it simply means the presence of salmon in a habitat, in a community of shared aliveness, what some of us call ecosystems, gives richness to the entire community. It brings diversity. Salmon quite literally feed hundreds of other beings in the oceans and the lands. The fact that they're migratory means that they bring enormous amounts of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, from the oceans to relatively poorer lands, feeding the lands with the wealth and the richness of the Arctic. Not only animals, but trees feasting on salmon flesh.
Yes.
Drinking salmon flesh, growing larger in the presence of healthy salmon runs.
Yes, there have been careful biochemical analyses of the flesh, or rather the wood in the trees in the huge forests of the Pacific Northwest, the forested mountains, there, it turns out every tree is infused with salmon. That salmon ingredients are within all the trees of the Northwest coastal forests, in some way that the salmon and the forests are so tightly co-evolved. The forest is utterly dependent upon these beings.
Yeah. Another piece of, I'll stick to the science of ecology for a minute, because something came up recently that is still blowing me away, and I still wonder at it, though there are no clear conclusions yet, but there are hypotheses that are becoming really fascinating, especially since Glasgow is ongoing now, and climate is one of the great issues, not the only great issue, but one of the great issues that we need to relate to. When I published my book, I was painfully aware that there wasn't enough knowledge in 2017, that we didn't yet had enough knowledge on the ways in which fish in the oceans interact with the carbon cycle. We already had knowledge about how the presence of whales, I'll be technical for a moment, but bear with me for a minute. The presence of the great whales in the oceans, the blue whales, the fin whales, the humpbacks, and all the others, draws carbon out of the atmosphere. So much so that we can measure that. We can quantify the gift of carbon sequestration to the oceans. It's a beautifully entangled process involving algae, involving albatross, and a whole community, but at the heart are the whales. Now, there wasn't yet research about fish, but now there is, and it only just came out this autumn, that there does seem to be something the scientists are calling a fish pump. The fact that the presence of large amounts, populations of wild fish, we're talking wild fish, in the oceans, does seem to be contributing to drawing carbon from the atmosphere in such amounts that it actually contributes to, over time, balancing the delicate balance in the carbon cycle. I'm getting a sign here that time is running brutally fast. So I'll just stop there, but I just dip into one brief thing and then just invite you back in, David. Another perspective on shape-shifting and salmon as the ultimate gift givers in the land, perhaps even as beings who teach us that perhaps it is more realistic and more, as you say, parsimonious and precise, as you say in the spell of the Sensious, not to speak of the land as resources, as we're so used to doing, or even as ecosystems, but as gifts, as the world gifting itself in so many embodiments, in so many ways. And Salmon is one of the teachers who are really able to show us that convincingly. And just one brief way in which I can try to illustrate that, when we spoke about this, the Sami word, I do not speak Sami, I picked that up from literature. Disclaimer, the Sami word, Sulva Jux, the anthropologist from Kautokeino, she writes about this. The Sami word bivdit, has a dual understanding. It means to take fish. Me, I am the subject, and I act upon you. But it also means to ask the other to give themselves to me, to grace me with the gift of their life. So in other words, to speak the word bivdit is a verb. I already enter into a relationship, into a kinship relationship with another, whom I acknowledge as somebody who will feed me, because I need to eat. Humans are heterotroph animals. We need to eat other lives to survive. Unlike plants, who are autotroph. They make their own food. But I can do so ignorantly, arrogantly, without compassion, without wisdom, or I can do so with humility, with love perhaps even. There you go.
In some mysterious way, these salmon are, well, in English we have this term, it's an old sort of magic term, elementals, that the the beings who are sort of the living sentient avatars of a particular element, salmon as the elementals of the river, but also of the ocean itself. When we think of them as separate, autonomous beings, or when we think of any species as a separate, separable creature, including ourselves, maybe we do a big violence. There's some manner in which, I mean, this is made obvious by the conundrums of long-distance migration for so many species, including the salmon. Our scientific brothers and sisters are confounded by these vast long-distance navigational feats. Like salmon can, once they come back into the ocean, the Pacific salmon, spread out all across the Pacific, and a particular run of salmon that, is endemic to a single stream can then head out through the Columbia River into the broad ocean, and we can find them when they tag these salmon. They find them in northern Japan, in the waters of the Kamchatka Peninsula, up in Alaska, down far to the south. And they circulate in this immense way for 2 years, 3 years, sometimes 5 years for certain salmon runs. And yet, they all gather back at the mouth of the Columbia within days of one another when it's time to head back upstream. And they all fly, and no one knows, how can they pull this off? How do they do this? How do they even find their way back to that starting point? Once they get near the Columbia, it seems obvious that they smell the particular taste of the water from there, and can follow those smells up into the headwaters and to the smaller streams. But once they're out in the broad ocean, how do they also get the timing right to all assemble just within a few days of one another? It seems to me that in trying to understand these astonishing mysteries, our problem and confusion is that we think that the salmon are doing it on their own, or that the monarch butterflies, when they, over 5 generations, make this cycle back to the same trees that their great-great-great-grandparents overwintered at. And we try and explain it by internal compasses and internal clocks and their internal cognitive maps, as though these animals, the salmon as well, have inside them all little replicas of these human technologies that we build. We seem unable to think in any other way. But the mystery transforms if we allow that the salmon, the cranes who you experienced as a child, they're not accomplishing this, they're not doing it alone. That the earth is itself a living power, an agency, a very complex, immense body, this huge spherical metabolism in which our individual physiologies are all embedded. When we allow that the earth itself is alive, then we realize that these creaturely migrations are like gestures within the body of the living planet, that they are the way that different places exchange nutrients with one another and cleanse themselves, and then get replenished and re-cleansed. And they trade nucleotides, they trade DNA, they trade rich ocean nourishment with the mountains, and the mountain forests trade their insights and their sentience with the oceans, that these migrations are living gestures of a breathing physiology. And so the salmon are not sort of trying to figure out, okay, when do I get back to that river? They're just following the solicitations, the beckonings, the coaxings and lurements of the land and of the ocean and of the waters themselves, because they're just one part, as we are too, of this vast, living, breathing air. Yeah.
I'm receiving a few hand signs from over there. I do wonder, and this is a question to you, Sina, do we have some minutes for some engaging with you dear people here?
Så dialog. Jeg kan si at det kommer også til å bli en fortsettelse av denne samtalen senere i kveld. Det vil bli en premiere på en forestilling, en kunstnerisk tolkning av animisme. Det vil bli en premiere på en forestilling nå, halv, en kunstnerisk tolkning av animisme. Med hvor Martin Müller og Thierry Bryn har skrevet manuset, og vi tre skal performe sammen. Etter det så vil samtalen mellom David og Martin fortsette. Og det en sånn gave som vi kom på i går kveld. Så det hjertelig velkommen til å bli værende og hygge dere med vindbruk og ja, i samtale og i dialog. Så det skal være en pause nå, men jeg tenker at noen spørsmål kan vi ta, og så tenker jeg at vi kanskje kan holde på noen av de spørsmålene også til etterpå, at det går an å være med på den dialogen videre utover kvelden. Føles det greit? Ja. Vi er i samtale. Okay.
Happy to share this microphone.
I think invite questions.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for a very interesting session. I work with freshwater conservation, and I believe I've listened to you a couple of times on a few other discussions with podcasts and the like. You said that it would be very interesting and necessary to return to the oral traditions, and I think you're very much right, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on maybe if you think that our current linguistic traditions, with their perhaps rigidity of rules and right and wrong ways of speaking and writing and maintaining a sort of status quo of how we communicate, having everything in a written style and the way we speak reflecting that, if this is in conflict with the magic in the way we communicate through a more sort of oral tradition type of culture.
Well, it's yes, and it's a huge and really fascinating topic, this matter of word magic, really. And so let's, if it's possible for folks to linger after the performance, really continue and take up this matter. But one can say, I'll just offer a simple thought or two. One that literate culture is inherently cosmopolitan. It makes possible the sharing of stories from many different places. and from many different times. And so inaugurates that rich cosmopolitan buzz of our cities and makes city life so delicious, really. But the stories come from many different regions and places and cultures, so it's kind of placeless. But digital culture and the culture of the internet is even more disembodied and abstract. I would say if literate culture is inherently cosmopolitan, the culture of the internet is inherently global and globalizing. But oral culture, the culture of face-to-face and face-to-place storytelling, is inherently local. It's the stories we tell in this valley, and we're not writing them all down. So these stories stay here. They don't so easily travel beyond the mountain ridge to the next valley. They are the story of how things happen here in this land, or on the banks of this river, or in the waters of this river, and how we need to live in this terrain. And so oral culture is inherently local, and it has this somewhat magical quality to it, because every indigenous, traditionally oral culture we know of seems to assume that everything is alive and that everything speaks, although most things don't speak in words, but things speak. The river itself has its many voices that inform you as you walk near the river. The splashing speech of the waves on the pebbled beach, the speech of the wind in the willows, that too is a voice. Of course, birdsong is a voice, or the songs and squeals of humpback whales, but also the voice of the thundercloud and thunder itself, this huge word, this huge voice, cricket rhythms. Ever so many, we live in a world filled with rich, meaningful speech. Everything is expressive. With writing and formal writing systems, human language begins to separate itself off from the speech, from the conversation of the world. And particularly with phonetic writing, or what we call the alphabet, it's as if only when the alphabet comes into a previously oral culture, often carried by Christian missionaries teaching the Bible and trying to teach their ABCs to folks so they can read the Bible, only when the alphabet comes into a previously oral culture does that culture get this odd idea that language is an exclusively human property. And everything else in the land begins to fall mute. It no longer seems to speak. This brings a huge change, and it's the last thing I'll just say in response to your question, brings a huge change in how we speak. Because if I assume that everything speaks, then my own speaking has to respond to the conversation of the world, and of the river, and of the rain, and the wind. And so I'm always attending to the music of my speaking, and the rhythm, and the melody in my talking, because I know that's what the other animals hear of it. They don't get the dictionary meanings. But once I assume, or get this peculiar, mad notion that only humans speak, then I stop listening to the voices in the land, but not just that. I stop feeling that the land itself, that the forest trees and the grasses and the clouds and the river itself is listening to me as I speak. And so I start talking about the world. I no longer talk to the mountain, I just speak about the mountain. I no longer talk to the wind and the weather. I just talk about the weather with others. That is, we spend most of our time in a highly literate culture talking about the land and about nature and about the weather, about the world behind its back, as it were. And so that's a very, very different use of language and a very different sense of what language is good for. Yeah, it becomes for us a tool for figuring out the world rather than a way to reach and touch the world and call the world into relation with me or call myself into relation with the river. That's a very different use of language.
We will have time for one brief intervention, but I'd just like to say you've just described the basic impetus behind the performance we're about to hear.
I know. That's what I did.
It's called Akshavas Tusen Stemmer, the 1,000 voices of the Akshava River. Yes. You don't need to know.
Ko tawa, ko kwe, tawa ko kwe, ko papa tuanuku, ko kwe, papa tuanuku, ko kwe. I, together with you, and the river together with you is me. I, together with Mother Earth, together with you, Mother Earth, is we.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here.